Investigative journalist Ruth Hopkins has been following the story for many years. Her book, Misery Merchants, exposed the conditions at this privately run facility. And she joins us now. Ruth, thank you so much for your time. Before we look into your book and the expose of your book, I want to just get your input on the latest developments. We've finally heard from G4S. They've been really quiet. But their press release this afternoon making it clear, saying we did all the right things, essentially. We immediately had suspicion around 3 prison warders who we suspended, who've now been fired, but we very quickly raised suspicions and handed it back to the Department of Correctional Services, not saying whether they still believe that Bester died in that fire, which they were saying up until quite recently. What do you make of their response and how they've handled this matter?
Well, it just seems to me as if they're quite evasive and they're not really very open about what factually actually happened. And I've been talking to my prison sources, people I know who are currently still in the prison or who formerly worked for the prison or who are formerly incarcerated in the prison. And I'm hearing very different stories, and not just by G4S, but also DCS knew at quite an early stage that, for example, the DNA didn't match, and they didn't really act on it. It's taken journalists to blow this case open, whereas DCS and G4S knew already that there was something wrong here. And inmates in the prison were telling officials already, I think, a year ago that Bester had escaped, that Bester hadn't died. So they knew, but G4S equally as DCS.
And that's interesting. Let's probe a little more into the relationship between the two, because this is a prison that was built by G4S under contract to Correctional Services. That contract, I think, to now run the prison ends around 2026. It's not going to be renewed. But it seems that the two obviously have had to cooperate. And the fact that that contract didn't get axed back in 2013 after those horrific prison riots, which were all over the news, which were terrifying, which of course led to your expose, surely that says that up until now at least, the relationship's been a really tight one.
Yeah, it has. And actually, my expose came before the prison riots. And in my expose, I uncovered that for years, the company was injecting inmates with antipsychotic drugs against their will as a form of crowd control. Again, this had been reported to DCS, reported to the government. They knew. And they took over the prison when these riots happened, and they were going to investigate everything, all the irregularities and the human rights violations, and they were going to publish their investigation report. And DCS then refused to release that report. And I had to chase it through the courts, and it took about 5 or 6 years before DCS finally released that report, their own investigation report. And at the time, the Minister of Correctional Services, Sbu Ndebele, he said he was going to leave no stone unturned, and G4S would be held accountable. But nothing of that happened. Sbu Ndebele disappeared. He was appointed abroad. A new minister took over and was very pleased with the G4S prison. So it seems to me it very much looks like DCS covers up for G4S, and that might be because there's a lot of money involved.
Yeah, and I mean, we always say in journalism, you follow the money if you really want to find out what's going on. And while we know that 3 prison warders have since been fired, I think it was Gayton McKenzie, who's a politician but a former prisoner himself, he sent out a series of tweets saying there is absolutely no way that just a few prison wardens were involved in this. Getting out of a maximum security prison like that would have taken massive cooperation at a number of levels. You have been speaking to a lot of prisoners and you've got this relationship. Would you say that Gayton is absolutely correct?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And also the police must have been involved. And the responsible police station for Mangaung prison is Bloemsprout Police Station. And since I did my research, which is since 2012, prisoners who've been tortured or forcibly injected with antipsychotic drugs reported this to the police, and they haven't followed up on a single case. So they are definitely also part of the cover-up. And I think what's also interesting in this respect, like I just said, you know, there's a lot of money involved, and it doesn't just go to the global multinational G4S. It also goes to South African companies, to Bloemfontein Correctional Contracts, the consortium of shareholders that have really close links to the ANC. So that they're, again, protected by South African society. And that's a really sad thing, because South Africa has a proud history in the field of human rights. And it's a very sad thing that such miserable things are happening in broad daylight, really, and getting constantly covered up in a country that, you know, fought for human rights.
Talk to me, I mean, you've mentioned twice now that antipsychotic drugs were injected into inmates against their will. And this is part of what you uncovered back in 2012, 2013. Then versus now, have conditions changed at the prison, to your knowledge?
No, I don't think so. I was just today speaking to an inmate who told me how he had been burnt, he had been beaten up, he had been electroshocked to such an extent that he ended up in ICU. And this happened really recently. And since I've done my prison investigation, somehow prisoners managed to find me on social media or on WhatsApp or whatever. And since because I don't live in South Africa anymore, I moved away in 2019. And since then, prisoners still find me, and they still have the same stories. I do believe that the forced injections with antipsychotic drugs have reduced, but they haven't disappeared, because I still get prisoners writing to me about that issue as well.
Quite a lot has been made of the fact that this is a privately run prison. We know that in South Africa, prison conditions are not good, and we know that there's corruption, there's gang activity in, I think, pretty much every prison. Do you think there's a marked difference between a privately run prison and the problems within that prison and what we see in all prisons in South Africa?
Yeah, definitely. There's a problem in South African prisons. They're highly dysfunctional. I mean, I used to work for the Wits Justice Project in Johannesburg, and have visited, I think, probably up to 20 or 30 prisons in the country, a lot of them state-run prisons. And indeed, they are also violent and often dilapidated and not well run. But Mangaung prison really was the most violent, horrible prison I've come across. And I think that's because the profit incentive is attached to everything. So the profit incentive is attached to incarcerating people. So there are people who are driven by profit and who just put profit above everything else, you know. And you can see that in the way the company runs its business, but you can also see that in the way the employees act. I mean, I think the Bester escape points to guards trying to earn a bit of extra money, you know, and that's exactly actually what G4S is also doing. It's all about the money, and human rights, humanity, human dignity is very much secondary. And again, that is just incredibly sad that is happening without any accountability in South Africa, that has a country with such a proud and an impressive history in the field of human rights, that this is just going on and on and on, and there's zero accountability, and that shouldn't really be accepted.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, and also shining a light on the very alarming story of what is going on to this day in that prison, despite an expose, despite a report into human rights abuses in Mangaung Correctional Centre. That's investigative journalist Ruth Hopkins. She's also the author of Misery Merchants, which of course exposed conditions at that Mangaung prison from which Thabo Bester escaped recently.